Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
It's Lindsay Smith Rogers. Today, Legionnaires' disease. Johns Hopkins environmental scientist Natalie Exum joins me to talk about the symptoms, treatment, and who's most at risk. We also talk about the current outbreak in New York, how it was detected, and what you should do if you live in an area with an outbreak. Let's listen. Natalie Exum, welcome back to Public Health on Call. You're becoming one of our regulars.
It's always a good time to be here with you, Lindsay. Thanks for having me.
So today we're talking with you about Legionnaires' disease. But first, our audience already knows you as an environmental scientist, but can you talk specifically about what you have been studying with Legionnaires' disease? How do you know about this?
Yeah, so Legionnaires' disease is caused by something called Legionella bacteria. And this is a waterborne pathogen. Actually, it's the number one cause of waterborne outbreaks in the U.S. But unlike a lot of other pathogens in water that give you vomiting and diarrhea, this one gives you a lower respiratory infection called Legionnaires' disease. And in my lab, we're studying this because this is really important for older cities that have aging infrastructure where we tend to see more of this. And so we're currently doing lots of research in our laboratory right now here in Baltimore City.
Awesome. So let's talk about Legionnaires' disease specifically. You've already mentioned that it's caused by this bacteria. It causes a lower respiratory infection. So tell us a little bit about, how do you know you have it? Is there a treatment for it? What's the prognosis if you get it?
Yeah. So of all the pneumonias that you can get, this tends to be one of what we call the atypical pneumonias. So, there are lots of causes of pneumonia. This one is not, I would say, a major one. But it is a really important one because when you do get sick with Legionella bacteria, it can cause a very severe infection that will or could land you in the hospital. It's, it kind of tends to start with a high fever, chills, lethargy, a cough, and it's really, really serious. And so often you know that you have it when you've gotten yourself to the hospital. And oftentimes they will do a urinary antigen test to kind of tell you on the spot if you have a specific type of this bacteria.
Is there a treatment for it?
Yeah, actually, and this is the important part. Antibiotics will take care of it quite rapidly, right? But if you're not kind of getting that quick attention, or if the disease progresses really quickly, it can become a really dangerous and scary situation.
Is it dangerous and scary for everybody that gets it, or are there people who are more at risk than others?
No, and that's important to note here, right? That this tends to be current or former smokers, over 50, immunocompromised. And so, generally, if you're, a healthy individual walking down the street, this is not something that I would think should not be one of the worries of your day.
And so how do people come in contact with this?
Yeah, so a waterborne bacteria that causes a respiratory infection, you actually have to breathe in an air. So the water particles have to be aerosolized somehow through a humidifier, through your shower, through a sink, through a jacuzzi. You have to breathe it in and have been exposed to such an extent that it actually causes this infection.
Does it pass from person to person within a household?
No, it does not. And that's it. Well, so a whole household could be exposed potentially. So a number of people in your household could get sick, but you would not be getting sick from each other.
Okay, so let's talk just really briefly about what is going on right now in New York.
Yeah, really, really important here because New York, this is the second summer in a row that a large kind of cooling tower-based outbreak has occurred. And already 4 deaths have been reported. I think, maybe around 70 to 80 people have gotten sick. I imagine if you're living on the Upper East Side of Manhattan right now, it's been a really scary time.
And so they're getting sick from these cooling towers?
Yeah. So cooling towers, what they do is they circulate water and they blow down water so that your air conditioning system can not overheat. right? And so what ends up happening is the water in that cooling tower is in a closed loop system. The water kind of gets warm enough that these bacteria, at the temperature these bacteria do really love to grow at. And then if you don't have enough biocide or the chemical disinfectant to really keep them at bay and hopefully completely obliterate them, but if you don't have that, they can really replicate quickly. And that kind of that mist that then comes off of whatever is cooling down your infrastructure gets into the air. And in a dense environment like, Harlem or the Upper East Side, a number of people can be exposed. And that's what has ended up happening in the past few weeks.
And so the solution then is to look at the water supply, and you mentioned you can maybe treat it and that will kill off the bacteria.
Yeah, the solution is to treat those cooling towers. And you really kind of shock them with these chemicals to really make sure that you've gotten everything.
So you mentioned that this is the second summer in a row. I mean, how often do we see outbreaks of Legionnaire's disease, and do they typically happen in the summer, or is this just a new pattern?
Yeah, they do typically happen in the summer because that's when the water warms up. If you put your finger under your tap water, and if you're on the East Coast, and it's the winter, your water can be quite cold when it comes off out of the city. But, if you're to turn on your tap now during the summer and you put your finger under there, it's going to kind of be lukewarm, and you may need to throw some ice cubes in there for it to be at the temperature you like. So that's where we begin to see chlorine levels, because our drinking water systems generally have a residual chlorine level that's regulated by our Safe Drinking Water Act. It has to be above a certain level. But we begin to see those chlorine levels dropping, and then you see those temperatures rising, and those two things combined means that Legionella season is really upon us.
So is this only a concern for people who maybe live in cities that have this aging infrastructure, or can you find this bacteria, say if you have like a well or something like that?
You actually can find it in well water, especially because a lot of if you're getting well for your drinking water for your household pipes, often doesn't have chlorine in it. So the public drinking water systems are actually, there's some, trade-offs that are going on as well. But, cities tend to have older pipes, and maybe more, especially in buildings where you have more complex water systems. Once the water crosses from the street onto your property, there's no regulation anymore. And so that's where these problems can really proliferate.
So I just want to sort of go back a minute to the New York situation. How long does it take people to get sick with this? And how long does it take them to kind of figure out where it's coming from if you were to be a detective on this case?
Yes. And this is where New York is, I know it must seem like, New Yorkers are doing something wrong because they've had 2 outbreaks in a row, but I actually want to highlight how New York is actually doing something really right when it comes to this. So to your first question about the incubation period, how long does it take someone to get sick after they've been exposed? It's about 2 to 14 days. So it really can take a little bit of time for it to develop. And so that's just the nature of how this pathogen works. But New York City, because they know the challenges with the way their infrastructure is set up, they have actually put in place a cooling tower inventory. They've used some really kind of advanced machine learning technology to find every single cooling tower that they can and they know where every single cooling tower is. And they combine that register with a tool that the CDC uses called SAT-SCAN. And SAT-SCAN can kind of, based upon certain parameters, your geography, kind of underlying kind of conditions, be able to detect an outbreak really early on. And so those 2 cases that were found on July 2nd in New York City in that same proximity really did trigger the city to deploy their environmental health kind of people to say, okay, something's happening up here. We should be testing all of these cooling towers. I think they tested over 100 cooling towers. 76 of them came back positive based on DNA. We can get into all the molecular conversation later, but all to say, they were the speed at which they are doing this now. There was another outbreak in 2015 that went on for much longer. It's a really impressive effort with the speed at which they're able to identify this, deploy these teams, and then test and then treat these cooling towers.
And then, now that you've opened the door to it, like how you said DNA, genetic, what are they looking for?
Yeah. Well, and this gets to the laboratory side of it where, I study these bacteria in my lab as well. They take a long time to grow in the incubator. And then, you have to confirm it in another step. And it can be 2 weeks later sometimes when we can be absolutely sure that what we're finding by growing the bacteria is actually Legionella bacteria. What they're doing at the cooling tower itself is they've got a kind of we've a rapid test for looking for the DNA markers of Legionella bacteria then and there. And so within really 24 hours, you're able to get some sort of indication that there's Legionella bacteria there. You may find a DNA fragment that does not mean those bacteria are actually alive, but because of how rapid it is and how serious this outbreak was, they were willing to take a conservative approach and say, even if you find a dead piece of Legionella bacteria in a cooling tower, we want to know it because we want to treat for it.
Mm-hmm. So what's the overall takeaway from your perspective? Because I know the headlines can seem really scary. People may not know a lot about this disease. It's happening at a time when we're having some other like foodborne illnesses happening. So people are trying to put all of these outbreaks in context.
I know. Between the wildfire smoke and the cyclospora outbreak.
What a summer.
And the extreme heat. Do we really need another one here? And I would really say that the takeaway from this is vigilance for our water systems. If a dear friend of mine is living on the Upper East Side of Manhattan right now, what I would say to them is ask your building to say, do we have cooling towers? Are we treating them? Every building should be doing that, and there should be a plan in place for that. But really, it's vigilance for our water systems. If you're going on vacation this summer and you're going to be away from your house for a month, that means the water has been sitting in your pipes for a long, long time, with plenty of time for those Legionella bacteria to grow. When you get back from a long trip, open up your faucets and waste a ton of water by flushing your pipes. And, it'll get rid of Legionella bacteria, it'll flush those out, and a number of other things that can get into your water when your water stagnates. And I just think the takeaway here is continued vigilance, making sure your hot water heater is turned to 120, and just some small things to really realize, we're not living in a sterile world.
Mm-hmm. And maybe if you live in one of these areas and you're experiencing these symptoms, maybe go get checked out.
That's right. And it's a really easy way to get checked out because you don't want to let that disease progress.
Well, Natalie Exum, it's always a pleasure. You always have the best, most concise answers. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you, Lindsay. Thanks for doing it.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Rachel Walsh. Audio production by Michael Bonfils, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from J.B. Arbogast, Spencer Greer, and Chip Hickey. Distribution and social media by Rachel Walsh, with support from Nick Moran and Brianna Iacovelli. Follow us on Instagram and Blue Sky at Public Health Pod for more public health takes and special content. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.